Welcome to episode 5 of the DCS and IL2 Spitfire 9 comparison series. In this video we're going to be looking at landings, we'll look at use of flaps at high airspeeds, we're going to look at the way the aircraft fly with dirty configuration, and then we're going to take a quick look at Manifold Pressure Regulation right at the end. Let's get on with it. We're going to take a look at landing the Spitfires now, and there are a couple of fairly significant differences between the two. Now, due to the pace at which things happen during the landing procedures, we won't be able to discuss them at the time in any detail. So this is one of the few instances in this series where I actually want to discuss the differences before we do the exercise. This mainly relates to the attitude or the trim of the aircraft when the flaps are deployed. Now, the manual says that when the flaps go down, we should experience a strongly nose down trim change. That is, the nose should strongly drop down. In DCS, this will happen. When I deploy the flaps, the nose will push itself forward and we'll really notice that change in attitude. In IL2, it doesn't really happen. There is a very, very mild, let's say 1 or 2 degree kind of down meander of the nose, but the marked change in trim is actually a nose up. It's quite observable in level flight, but in the landing descent it's not so obvious. But when compared to the DCS Spitfire, there's a very significant difference in the change in the aircraft's attitude. During the actual landings that I show you, I'm going to anticipate the different nose movements with the flap. So it's not going to look very obvious from the landings when I do them. So before we do that, I'm just going to show you briefly what the flaps do in each of these aircraft on a pretend approach. Alright, the aircraft here is idling in a gentle descent, and I'm going to lower the flaps now. My hands are completely off every control column. So here we go, flaps down, and there you go. You'll notice the dramatic nose down of the aircraft, which we would need to correct for with trim and with elevator. We'll quickly look at what happens in IL2 now. This is the IL2 Spitfire then in a pretty much idling descent. I'm going to lower the flaps now. You'll see the nose adjusts down and then up quite considerably. So there's a very short momentary down adjustment, and then it comes up. In the cockpit in DCS, we are at about 130 miles per hour, just slowing down in a sort of downwind here. I've got an airfield off to my left, and it is a dirt runway quite close to the coast. I'm gonna go for about minus 3 pounds boost, minus 3 to minus 4. That should give us 110 to 120 miles per hour in the straight line in the downwind. Trimming on the rudder here, and in just a moment we'll start a left-hand turn, which is going to be our base turn. Once the airfield's about closing in on 45 degrees behind the wing, let's go now. Getting slow, apply a touch of throttle, and I'm going to now lower the landing gear. We'll lose a little bit of speed in that as the gear locks down, and then I'm also going to drop the flaps. Now the nose is going to lurch down, so I'm going to anticipate that by pulling back on the stick a bit and a bit of back trim. So we're getting a bit fast. Now we want to cross the threshold at 100 miles per hour indicated. That's the speed we're aiming for, and ideally we want to set up in our descent on 100, which is what we're heading now. We're getting a bit slow, so power on. I want to get the nose on the threshold here. Just bring the seat up a fraction. There's 100 miles per hour. That's a good approach speed. A bit fast here, so throttle back. And just as we come across the threshold, we're going to go into a level flight attitude. So it's not a nose up flare, it's just into a level flight attitude, and then we will reduce the throttle to try and bring the aircraft to a halt. So here we are, crossing at 100, and just bringing the airplane into a level flight attitude and reducing the throttle. Bit of ground rush there, and the front wheels are settling down, and then the tail comes down, and we have a little sort of 2-point landing there, followed by the tail settling, and we can increasingly apply brakes to bring the aircraft to a complete halt with a touch of rudder. I have heard people complaining about floating of the aircraft on landing, and if you do not hit the numbers, that is, if you don't hit your 100 miles per hour, and if you fail to chop the throttle, and if you overlift the nose when you flare, then this aircraft will float. But if you get your flying correct, then you shouldn't result in floating down the runway or severe bounces. You should be able to just give that aircraft a nice little nose raise into the level flying attitude, chop the throttle, and then as you feel that ground rush, as you see the ground rush with your eyes, the front wheels should settle down, and then half a second or a second later the tail should drop back down onto the runway. Keep it steady with a touch of rudder, little bit of brakes, and you should be able to do a stop within about 300 yards of where you touch down. We can watch the last few moments of the approach and the landing now from this external view location. Here comes the Spitfire now, just over the threshold. And there is the level flight attitude, and you can see the wheels at the front touching down the 2 points, and then half a second later the tail settles down onto the tarmac. We also noticed that the engine tone indicated that I had chopped the throttle. You could hear the popping just as the aircraft was going past the camera position, and that's because the throttle was at 0. And there you go, that's a relatively decent landing in DCS in the Spitfire 9. So I'm in the IL2 Spitfire here in a downwind at 130, and the first thing you'll notice is that flying this aircraft at 130, I have to bring the nose up considerably to prevent the aircraft from descending. So you end up with quite a higher nose up attitude in IL2. And that kind of comes into play also when you are on the landing approach. We have gotten a little low here now as a result, because we are descending despite me trying to fly at 120. And I'm holding 120 now, and we're just starting to climb. Now I'm going to go into a left-hand turn soon. This isn't going to look quite the same as the DCS landing, and partly because of the difference in nose attitude. But we'll go around, starting to descend now in towards that threshold. I'll bring the gear in relatively soon. Okay, time for the gear. Now the gear's going to drop. Bring the throttle right back. And as we roll out onto the straight section of the approach, I'm going to drop the flaps. And I'm going to anticipate the flaps by holding the nose forward. So the nose wants to rise and I'm pushing it forward. And now it settles. Okay, we can put some power on. Okay, so now we're settling into a very similar looking final approach. We're a bit straighter and a bit further out. Possibly just a little bit flatter than we are in DCS. Now if I bring the throttle back now, the airspeed will come back to that 110 mark. And we'll just lower the nose. It's a little bit flatter than DCS, but it's not terrible. And we'll just start settling into a flying attitude now. Coming up over the threshold. And now, when I chop the throttle, I do just have to hold the nose down a fraction. Just have to hold the nose forward a bit. And there we are, coming to a close now with a bit of brakes. And a bit more brakes, and a bit more brakes, and a bit more brakes, and a bit more brakes. There we go, just slowing the aircraft. Bit of right rudder there. And we'll just bring it to a halt. Okay, we let it run on for just a little bit longer than we did in DCS. But the main differences here are slightly higher nose-up attitude in order to maintain level flight in the downwind. That has some follow-on effects. But the key difference really is the nose up pitching when you drop the flaps, and you do have to anticipate that with a good forceful nose forward push on the control column. We can also now take a look at the external views of that landing. Spitfire is on its slightly straighter approach than with DCS here. That's down to the pilot, not the aircraft. And as you can see, we're just about to level off. And just flying level for a second or two, there are the front wheels, and the tail wheel dropped in almost immediately afterward. And a pretty stable rollout there, straight down the runway. On to flap deployment at higher speeds then. I'm in the IL2 Spitfire here, about a couple of hundred feet above sea level. There is no wind, and I am at 10 pounds boost and 2800 RPM, which is going to be the setting I use in both aircraft. My airspeed is sitting around the 290 to 300 mark indicated, and I'm going to lower the flaps. Let's drop the flaps now. The indicator will drop down. So down go the flaps. And there is absolutely no impact on airspeed or attitude. Now at first this seems weird, but don't be alarmed. We'll go to the external views and we'll see what's really going on here. You can see the flaps have not deployed. In fact, there is too much air pressure for the pneumatic system to override it, and the flaps simply will not deploy until I slow the aeroplane down. So I'm going to reduce the throttle, just change the view slightly. So hopefully we can get a better view of these flaps, and you can see them just starting to deploy now, very slightly, as the forces start to equalize out. Down they come, and I'll pull the nose up and we'll get quick reduction in airspeed, and the flaps will start deploying fully as we do that. And you can see the airspeed is probably around 200 miles per hour where that began. This means obviously it is very difficult to damage the flaps in high speed if you accidentally deploy them, because they simply won't drop down, which is, I understand, correct. However, I'm not entirely sure. Either way, it certainly makes sense that high amounts of air pressure would buffet against those flaps and prevent them from deploying at some speed at least. What we'll now do is take a look at having the flaps already deployed and going into a high speed dive to see whether the flaps will tear off. Let's now check the flaps at high speeds in a powered dive. I'm at 160 miles per hour indicated here, so I'm going to release the flaps, deploy them, and we'll just check visually outside. Yes, the flaps are deployed. And now I'm going to put the aircraft into a dive. So I'm just going to let the nose drop, let a bit of speed build up, and start putting some throttle on. Right, so here we are passing through the 200 mile per hour range. We'll check and see if the flaps naturally return to the up position with the forces of the wind. And you can see they've stayed down for now. Try and get some more airspeed. Coming up on 260, we'll be approaching 280 or 300 in a moment. And from the outside of the airplane you can see the flaps are still deployed. And there they come. So naturally, at about 300, the flaps just fold back up into the wing. Now, if you take these two mechanisms together, that would suggest that it is not possible to actually damage the flaps by overspeeding them in the IL2 Spitfire. Now we'll look at the DCS variant. I'm in the DCS Spitfire here, cruising along at just under 300 miles per hour with similar settings to IL2. I'm going to now try and deploy the flaps, so down go the flaps. And you'll see that we get the nose down that we saw on our landing approach, but the flaps are not actually deploying at this airspeed. So I'm just going to go back into the cockpit. So we did get the nose pitching down, which we see on landing approach, but the flaps aren't physically deploying. Just go back to external views again and try and drop the flaps one more time. And now they are just starting to deploy ever so slightly. But in order to get them to deploy fully, I have to reduce airspeed, which I'm going to do by nosing up. Down comes the airspeed, and down come the flaps. So the fact that the flaps don't fully deploy or don't deploy at high airspeeds is basically the same as in IL2. The speeds at which this activity occurs is slightly different, but the principle remains the same. What I do notice though in DCS is that at high airspeeds, whilst the flaps are not deploying, they seem to have forgotten to remove the strong nose down trim change. And so what is in fact happening is the nose is pitching down, but the flaps are not deploying. And they seem to have coupled the nose pitching action with the flap lever rather than with the flap itself. So I suggest they need to change that. The nose pitching down should be coupled to the deployment of the flaps and not to the movement of the flaps down lever. Let's go to the high-speed dive test now, and we'll look at up at some altitude now in the DCS Spitfire. Just go to the external views so you can see the flaps are up, the lever shows them up, and the flaps are in the up position. I'm currently doing about 220 indicated. I'm going to drop the flaps now. Down they go, and there's the nose change. I'm just arresting that with a bit of elevator. And externally we can see the flaps are now down. I'm going to drop the nose. So down comes the nose, a little bit of left rudder here. And let's watch the airspeed come up. I'm going to apply some throttle to try and expedite this process. And down we go, through 240 now. 260. Quick check to see if the flaps are still deployed, which they are. Coming up on 280. Now the aircraft is struggling to gain airspeed. We would normally be accelerating well beyond this airspeed by now. In fact, it's really struggling to get past 280. The flaps are still in the down position. There goes 300. We're just accelerating a bit more quicker now. And the flaps are still in the down position. 320. And it looks like the flaps are now coming up. So yes, the flaps are now fully retracted back into the wing, similar to what we saw in IL2. And I'm wildly out of trim here. Apologies for that. That's what happens when you're focusing on the wrong parts of the aircraft. We're going to just pull the aircraft back into a climb. Airspeed will reduce. Now the flaps are still in the down position on the lever, so they should come back down of their own accord as we bleed off some of that airspeed. And there they go. So once again, the speeds at which the flap deployment happens is a little different from IL2. There was that interesting situation at about the 280 miles per hour mark where the airspeed indicator seemed to just hold on that position for quite some time. Can't be entirely sure whether that is down to pilot error or not, whether my attitude was changed, or whether that is actually a feature of the aerodynamics. But once again, quite similar to IL2, except for the speeds at which these activities are occurring. Having looked at using the flaps in a high airspeed situation, we're now going to go to the other end of the flight envelope, and we're going to look at how the aircrafts handle in a dirty configuration at very low airspeeds. And by dirty configuration, I mean with the flaps down and the gear down. I'm in the DCS Spitfire here, 2900 RPM and enough boost to give me about 220 miles per hour indicated airspeed. I'm now just going to dirty the aircraft up by lowering the gear and by dropping the flaps, adjust the trim and everything just for that now, and we'll quickly check the external views to make sure everything is down. Excellent. Now I'm going to throw the boost forward and we'll just gain a little airspeed, and then we'll pull the nose up and get the aircraft slow. So let's pull the nose up now, and I'll try and keep it relatively trimmed at the same time. Okay, there's a nice nose up attitude, relatively close to the vertical, and we're down at 100. Still got some control response. Down at about 70 now, I've got no control response, and the aircraft has in fact spun and stalled and fallen out of the sky. And you can see I have blown the radiator there. In fact, there's a lack of airflow to the radiator, which means that it is now steaming all over the place, and the engine will seize up pretty shortly. Okay, so the aircraft basically started falling out of the sky at about 70 miles per hour indicated. Firstly, just control surface loss, and then we stopped flying, and then about the same time as the airflow stopped over the radiators, we have this engine failure problem as well. That again in DCS. This time we'll start off with a slightly higher airspeed. I will just need to slow down enough to lower the flaps and the landing gear. We should be able to achieve that now. So let's just tell it to start lowering those things. Check outside quickly. Yep, everything's coming down now. Right, so throttle on. I'm not going to go with quite as much throttle as last time. We'll see if we can avoid the radiator bursting. We'll get the aircraft in the nose up, trim it out. There we go. It's about 60 degrees nose up. And we're coming back through 120 now. I've still got some aileron control, but it's very limited. I've got a little bit of rudder authority. Oh no, there we go, we've lost it. A very tiny touch on the rudder now. I've got no elevator, no aileron, and we're at about 70 miles per hour indicated. And we managed to avoid blowing the engine that time. Okay, we'll just pull the nose up quickly again with flaps and gear down. And once again, airspeed coming back. Very sloppy now, 80. A little bit of aileron control still. No, there we go. Ailerons have stopped working. And we've lost all our airspeed at around the 70 mile per hour mark. Again. So fairly consistent. We'll now just raise the gear. So I've just told the gear to retract. Quick check. There it is, coming up. Okay, the gear's coming up. And a bit of airspeed now. So just the flaps are down this time. And back into the nose up attitude. Showing 130, 120, 100. Still got a bit of aileron here. Oh, no, I've lost aileron. I've got left aileron but not right aileron because one of the wings is stalled, and I can just bring it back into control at about the 75 to 80 knot mark. And we'll bring the nose up quite quickly again. Pretty much the vertical now. No rudder. I've got no rudder already. I've got limited aileron, no left aileron, just right aileron there, and we've stalled, and now we're falling out of the sky. And there's the radiator. Again, lack of airflow through the rads. Okay, so it's a fairly consistent response. When the aircraft is dirty, it will lose airspeed and control authority at around the 75 or 65 knot mark, in that region. It will often result in blowing the engine or the radiator, and one wing tends to stall before the other, which means I get one aileron seems to be giving me some input, the other doesn't. The rudder seems to go quite early as airflow over the rudder fails, and then spinning and falling out of the sky is almost inevitable under that situation. Taking a look in IL2 now, similar setup in terms of boost and RPM and altitude. We'll just lower the flaps and the gear. And a quick check outside to confirm that they are in fact coming down. Okay, flaps are down and gear is now low. So we can bring the aircraft now into a nose-up attitude and applying some power at the same time. Up we go, a little bit of left rudder. And we get ourselves close to that vertical attitude, bit more there. Okay, there we go. Airspeed 120. And 80, still got good aileron response, and I can pull back on the stick and just losing the attitude there, but I'm actually holding the nose up and we just lose it there at about 75 it was showing. I'm going to bring the nose straight back up. I'm actually holding this aircraft back on the elevator the whole time, so it never really stopped completely flying. Well, I am able to hold it up. I don't know if we're sinking, but with a lot of effort on the control column, I can actually kind of keep this aeroplane flying. I think we are sinking a little bit, but I'm able to hold the nose up. I've actually had the stick back in the pit of my stomach this whole time. And the nose drops a fraction, but it quickly just regains flight. We managed to just sort of hover around the 70 knot mark. I'm actually just going to increase throttle a bit now and we'll see if we can really just hold this aircraft in the sky. And you can see the airspeed dropping now through 70, 65, and I've got control response. It's a bit weak there just as we get round to the 70 mark, but it just quickly recovers. The aircraft never really spins or falls out of the sky. It just seems to want to kind of wash a little bit. I'm going to try and use a little bit less right rudder here. No, I can actually correct the airplane with rudder at 65 miles per hour indicated airspeed, and it quickly recovers. It's a really strange kind of sensation. It just feels like the aircraft is sitting on something like a balloon, and it sinks a little bit, but it never really feels like it's properly stalling or spinning out. Now I'm going to raise the landing gear. You notice also that the engine has just kept ticking along as well at these incredibly low airspeeds. Doesn't seem to want to overheat. Okay, so now just the flaps are down, the gear is up. Here's the proof. Up we go. So same activity again. And we've got the nose up, pretty much vertical now. 80 knots. Still got excellent aileron control. I've got elevator response, aileron, just losing it there, but I can actually hold this just about. Let's try and pick the aircraft up. And we'll go just a tiny bit of buffet there. I'll bring the nose back up. And full aileron response. Nose is right up there. 60 miles per hour. I've still got rudder and aileron. Look, I'm actually rolling that myself. It's a little bit sloppy there. Actually, that's when the speed comes up a bit. So it's very different from the DCS Spitfire. This thing kind of just wants to stay in the air. So have a look at that from the outside now, just so you can see what I'm talking about. We've got the nose up, and we'll basically be just about stalling out here and spinning in the DCS Spitfire. So we'll just have a look at what's going on. I'll try and bring in a bit of right rudder and a bit of aileron just to keep that nose up. And that's kind of what happens. It sort of just does this. And you can see the aircraft sinking a little bit. But it's kind of flyable at this very low airspeeds. Just losing it a bit there, but I can correct and just get that nose back up. And it never really wants to fall out of the sky. Okay, just as a bit of a sort of extreme giggle test, I decided I would try and get this IL2 aircraft airborne with flaps down, gear down, and then try and just yank the nose up, keeping the aircraft in a dirty condition immediately after takeoff, just to see what happens. So here we go. Full throttle. Bit of right rudder there. Remember, flaps are down and gear is down. Okay, we'll hit about 120 mph on the airspeed indicator. There we go. And now I'm going to pull up. And I'm just going to nose up here. Still flying. Okay. And we've actually almost looped over. We just stalled one of the wings there. But, well, it's very controllable. I mean, just kind of did a half loop sort of stall turn. And the flaps and the gear are still both down. Let's yank the stick back. See if we can complete a loop here. Almost. Still at 100 miles per hour on the clock. So had I managed the rudder properly, we probably could have gone around on a full loop there. Gear and flaps still down. Up we go. Let's try and manage that a little bit better. Yeah, we are just getting a tiny bit of impact on stability at the top, but it's nothing you can't manage. Now we've done 3 of those sort of half loop stall turny type things, and we're just ticking along now quite merrily. We'll just do the same little fun test in DCS now, just so we've got them both compared. And in DCS, just putting the flaps down there, and we'll make a quick external check, flaps and gear. They'll stay down, and I will now go for the takeoff. So let's get this aircraft airborne. Going to go for the full boost, just as we did with IL2. Nose is coming down now. Just a little bit torquey there. Okay, we'll get the aircraft up. And there's 120. So just above 120, nosing up now. Okay. Oh no, I've lost control. We are now in, and I have also lost the engine. The radiator has gone, and I still can't recover this aeroplane. Okay, try and recover. No chance. Okay, we'll do that one more time just to confirm that that is actually what's happening here. So, flaps down. There they are. And off we go. This time I'm going to go with just a slightly lower amount of engine boost and possibly RPM, because I want to try and see if we can achieve this without blowing the engine. I'm also going to give the aircraft a chance to get up a little bit faster. So let's go with 140 this time. Back on the stick. Okay, I'm just trying to manage the loop the whole way. No, not enough airspeed. Aircraft's too dirty and it will not fly, and I've gone and busted the radiator again, and you can see the way we fell out of the sky there. I'll just pause that. You can see the way that the smoke or the steam coming out of the radiator worked, that we've just basically fallen out of the sky and the aircraft's toppling. I'm 99% sure I'm not going to be able to recover this. No chance. Still really haven't recovered flight. Reluctantly, I just want to add a quick note at the end of this. Throughout the series, I've been a bit shy about comparing the aircraft to real life, in inverted commas, and I've been trying to focus rather on comparing one aircraft against the other, just to point out the differences between the two. However, in the case of this low airspeed, dirty configuration flying, I feel it's worth making some kind of statement overall about how I think the physics and the flight modelling are represented here. When I conducted the tests in IL2, I actually had to do them about 10 times in order for me to be sure that what I was seeing and experiencing was actually happening in the sim. I was worried that perhaps I had the wrong difficulty settings, or there was something else I wasn't aware of that was causing the aircraft to fly the way it was flying. However, having conducted the test many times over and having also looked online at a few other videos, I'm pretty confident that what we saw there was really what happens in IL2. I think it's a major problem in the flight modelling, and I think the developers need to seriously consider that end of the envelope and how the aircraft is behaving there, because it just doesn't seem to stack up from a flight modelling perspective and from a physics perspective. The other major difference I see is there seems to be a very different interpretation between the two sims in the way engine overheating is represented. I think the DCS representation is far more sensible, that when the aircraft is at high RPM and high boost with no airflow going into those radiators, then they will burst very quickly. IL2 once again seems very, very forgiving with respect to how a virtual pilot manages the aircraft and their airmanship. As we conclude this episode in the series, we're going to have a look at side effects of the Rolls-Royce Manifold Pressure Regulator. And in order to do this, we're going to take the aircraft up to close to critical altitude for the supercharger. We're going to set to a relatively high RPM, and then we're going to look at the impact of the Manifold Pressure Regulator on boost and on the way that interacts in particular with the supercharger. I should add that I did have some help from Yo-Yo at Eagle Dynamics and from Thomas Palmer, who's a fellow simmer and has a YouTube channel, which I will link below, in order to get a handle on some of the finer manifold pressure details. Some of that obviously didn't make it into the video, but thanks to them still for their assistance with this aspect. Sitting in the DCS Spitfire now, and I'm flying along at about 13,000 feet. I'm going to set for about 2750 RPM here, and quite a lot of boost. I'm just going to push the boost up to the wall nearly. And at 2750 RPM, at this altitude, you'll see we're maintaining about 10 pounds boost. Now I've got the throttle fully firewalled. It cannot go forward anymore. Now as we climb, we will see the boost pressure decrease. So it's already decreasing there. You can see it's on its way down, and it's just about to hit the 10 pounds mark. And at around the 8 pounds boost mark, we'll actually transition to supercharger altitude, and the supercharger will kick in, and then suddenly we'll get our increase in manifold pressure again. But until that point, the regulator effect is having an impact on our boost. There we go, 2750 RPM, coming up now to 8 pounds and passing through 14,500 feet, just hitting 8 pounds of boost pressure now, so the supercharger should be engaging very shortly. There's the supercharger. The supercharger came on at 15,400 pounds, 15,400 feet. Now, if I reduce my throttle back to 0 and drop the nose, so there's no boost pressure, we're going to see when the supercharger disables with 0 boost pressure. It's 15,000. 14.5. Okay, it was about 14,400. So we'll boost back up again and watch the boost pressure slowly decrease as we go up in altitude. It's at about 9 pounds of boost pressure now, still sitting on 2750 RPM. Give the nose a bit more up this time. And what we're going to do this time is we're going to use the manifold pressure regulation to disable the supercharger earlier. And the way I'm going to do that is by actually flying along with higher boost in the dive. So coming up, supercharger should kick in about now. There it is. And I'm just going to retard and then advance the throttle again. And now we'll see when the supercharger turns off. So that's 15,000 feet and it's already off. So you can see the supercharger turned itself off at about 600 feet difference, depending on whether I was descending with the boost fully forward or the throttle fully forward versus having the throttle back in the idle position. So you can see here the effect of the manifold pressure regulation on this Rolls-Royce engine at around the critical altitude for the supercharger. Righty-ho, we're in the IL2 spit now at about the same RPM settings, and we're flying at about 11.5 to 12,000 feet at the minute. So I'm going to push the boost forward, and you'll see we've got about 12.5 pounds to 13 pounds boost pressure, and that should start decreasing just like it did in DCS as we climb. And already we can see we're now showing just below 12 pounds boost pressure. So we're just going to keep climbing. That boost pressure gauge will keep decreasing or keep descending, and at some point in the not too distant future the supercharger itself will turn on. Showing 10 pounds of boost pressure now, so it's steadily decreasing, and we're coming up on 14,000 feet indicated. There's the supercharger. So it came on bang on 14,000 feet, as we know. Now I'm going to drop the boost pressure and descend, and we'll see when the supercharger turns off. So this is with zero boost pressure, still about maintaining 2750. 13,000 now, and it's 12,500 feet with the boost pressure off. Now we'll turn the boost pressure back up, climb back up through supercharger altitude, and this time when we descend we're going to just adjust the throttle down and back up again and keep it on high boost as we descend back down through. And we're going to see if the supercharger disables at a bit of a higher altitude on the way back down. Supercharger should turn on right about now. There it is. And this time I'm going to keep the boost on there, and we've just started descent, and we'll see at which altitude the supercharger turns itself off, whether it's 12,500 feet or something a bit higher. It's 13.5. It's 13. Coming up 12.5 now, and it's turned off. So as you can see in IL2, the Manifold Pressure Regulation and its interaction with the supercharger is a little bit different from in DCS. In DCS, it's just a little bit more complex, and we can actually use the boost pressure to influence when the supercharger is engaging and disengaging. Whereas in IL2, these activities are basically linked directly to specific altitudes, rather than to the way the pilot has the engine set up in combination with the air pressure. So thanks everyone for watching part 5. We are coming to the very end of the series now. Part 6 will probably be the last video. In that one, I want to discuss some general issues. I don't really want to show any testing. I think we can just have a bit of a discussion about gameplay, a little bit of a chat about pricing and how that works with these various modules and games. And lastly, I do want to discuss damage modeling. It's probably going to be a very quick conversation, but I think it would be disingenuous to go through this whole discussion and focus so heavily on flight modeling and not make mention of the damage models. So we'll do that in episode 6. Thanks very much for watching. As usual, happy hunting, and I will see you up there.